All right, folks, let's go ahead and get going here. My name is Trevor Lecka, and I'm Dubsado's Customer Engagement Specialist. And today's webinar is all about bite-sized automations. And they are bite-sized automations with big impact, hopefully, for your business. Automations get talked about a ton these days. Obviously, everyone hears automate this, automate that, and it can be a little bit overwhelming to know even where to begin or what you should automate, why you should automate. And these are all things that I hope to talk about and address during this webinar today. Some of these things are going to be a little bit more entry level, brand new to automations. This is a great place to begin. But even if you are a wizened automations expert, hopefully there's still something you can take away from this webinar today. But I'm really happy to have everybody here, and I'm really excited to jump into this. So while I'm speaking, if you folks have questions, please feel free to utilize both the webinar chat or the Q&A. Either is totally fine. I'll be keeping a close eye on the webinar chat while we're going through things. We'll start off with some slides to kind of go through some things. And then we'll actually jump into a live demo in Dubsado once we get there. So it'll be a little bit of a mix and match today between slides and live demo. But again, please feel free to use that webinar chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to questions at the end for the most part, but like I said, I'll keep my eye on it. But anyways, let's go ahead and jump into it. So today's agenda, I kind of went through it just now a little bit, but we're actually going to talk about some industry data. I actually had that question to myself of like, okay, we all know we need to be automating things. We need to be making ourselves more efficient. But why though? Like, is that actually the case? Are we seeing that in the data that we're actually turning out now that some of these automation tools have been around for a couple of years now? And we're going to jump into some of that data and look at some actual studies because I'm curious about it. After we do that, we're actually going to take a look at which tasks should be automated, right? Not every single task necessarily needs to be automated. And sometimes it can be difficult to tell if you should or shouldn't automate a given task. And we have a little bit of a framework that can help you figure that out. Pardon me. There we go. Next up, we're going to go through some non-Dubsado automations. And of course, there are a ton out there. I highlighted three in particular that I thought were either essential or just fun. And we'll talk through what you can do without any Dubsado whatsoever. So if you're brand new to Dubsado and you just need to get something going, these are good options to start with. And then lastly, we're jumping into those Dubsado automations with some live demo. So we'll actually go through some of the really cornerstone automations, I think, in Dubsado. We won't have time to get through all of them, obviously, but we'll be demoing how to actually set up some of those things in your accounts to save you the most time. Then at the very end, if we have any leftover Q&A questions, we'll get to those as well. So hopefully that all sounds good to you folks. Rima asks, am I correct in saying there will be a video playback we can see afterwards? And yes, Rima, thank you so much for calling that out to me. As I always say, I like to mention this a couple times because folks usually ask. There will always be a video playback. You'll basically be receiving an email about an hour or two after the session is done with the Zoom recording. And we'll also go ahead and post this to YouTube as well later on the road. So keep an eye out for it in your email or on YouTube, and you can definitely watch this back. Cool. All right, so let's actually jump into it. So I have a question for y'all before we actually look at some data, but how many of you have heard one of these statements in the last calendar year, basically, maybe in the last 2 years? You need to automate more of your business, or automation is the key to scaling. I've personally heard that one a ton. Or you have to automate to keep up with the competition. And I'm guessing this is a bit of a leading question. You probably have heard all three of these. If you've heard all three of these, type a three in the chat for me. I want to see how many threes we got because my guess is it's probably most of you. If you've seen one or two of them, type a one or a two. Yeah, it's a lot of threes. That's what I imagined. And again, I knew it was a bit of a leading question, but I think it's important to actually think to ourselves, okay, these statements are repeated so often ad nauseum about how much we need to be automating, especially if you're a small business owner these days. I mean, as an employee of a company, I hear about how much we need to be automating. It is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But have we actually done any research or looked into or taken the time to ask ourselves, is it actually working? Is it worth doing it? And why should we be doing it? Elisa says some version of all three. Yeah, exactly. And Patricia says one. We got a ton of threes in here. Holy mackerel. Yeah. That's about what I figured, but cool. So that's why we're going to take a look at the data, because I think that having some of that data backed up in our heads and kind of seating ourselves and why we're doing something can make it a little bit more worth it when we're trying to actually set up some of these automations. And we know that we're actually going to get something out of it. So got a couple of studies that I highlighted for y'all. This first one is talking about improving some productivity. So we're looking at the International Journal of Entrepreneurship from back of October of last year. And they were looking at different businesses in both urban and semi-urban locations. And the brass tacks of it was that their research showed that automation improves productivity by up to 30% in small to medium enterprises. So 30% is pretty significant. That is a nothing to sneeze at, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. That is a significant amount of improvement in their productivity. But the thing that really surprised me about this study was that they also found that it reduced manual errors by up to 25%. And that's something that I think we don't really consider often because a lot of the questions we ask ourselves is should we or shouldn't we automate this thing, right? And the benefit of not automating something is you get to have that bespoke touch. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment here. But it does invite the opportunity for errors to occur. They're natural, they're human, and that's maybe part of what makes us human and makes our businesses unique, right? But obviously, we want to reduce errors if we can. If you automate the right things, it's going to reduce those errors by up to 25%. So you're not only more productive, but you're not accidentally making mistakes as well, which is pretty nifty. The next study, and I promise folks, we're not going to take too long on these studies because I know that looking at numbers can be like paint drying, but I do want to, like I said, talk through this. But the next study is talking about taking on more work, right? Which is something that I hear a lot from Dubsado users is maybe part of the reason that they actually joined Dubsado in the first place is, hey, I need to be able to scale, right? So this Celtra case study from November of last year was looking specifically and working with the South China Morning Post, which is a newspaper company, publication, and they were increasing the volume of campaigns. They wanted to increase the volume of campaigns that they produced without expanding their internal team. Another thing that I hear commonly is I need to do more work, but I can't afford to hire anybody right now, or I don't want to hire anybody. I don't want to spend more money essentially on what I'm doing in order to scale. And that's totally understandable. But what they were able to do with their workflow in place is they were able to see a 70% of reduction in time when they were creating variants, right? Which is something that we talk a lot about when we think about automations is iterating. So if we can reduce the amount of time it takes to iterate to the next thing, we can actually tackle more work and hopefully make more money, right? This allowed them to actually tackle 5 to 6 campaigns per month as opposed to 1 to 2 campaigns, which is, I think, the exact proof in the pudding that I'd want to see if I'm thinking about what kind of things do I want to automate and what am I going to get out of it as a business owner, right? You can actually increase your scale by, in this case, looks like a couple times, which is pretty great. Then we have the one that maybe is a little bit uglier, but it's a good one to look at. And it's the honest truth of the situation is that automating is becoming the table stakes of running a small business. If you are not automating, you are going to inevitably fall behind because your competitors likely are. We've got 2 studies here, one from Duke University and one from KissFlow Workflow Automation Research. And both of them found similar kind of findings in the sense that Duke found that 60% of businesses back in 2024, so a year ago, had already implemented some version of automated solutions. While the KissFlow workflow research found that 80% of organizations will adopt intelligent automations by 2025, so this year. So obviously these studies are, have a little bit of lag time, right? They're already a little bit old, and we're finding 60 or 80% of businesses are already doing this. And I don't say this to scare you, not far from it, right? It's just the reality that running a small business is going to require you to automate certain things just to make sure that you are keeping pace with what your competition is doing. Heath has a question. No. Oh, gotcha. Heath, I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. Heath just has some general questions. Heath, we're going to get to some Dubsado stuff in just a moment here if you stick with us. But we're going to talk a little bit more about some workflow stuff, non-Dubsado to begin with, and then we'll jump into the Dubsado stuff. So if you want to hang around, please, by all means, I'd love it. But no, Heath, I cannot hear you. Cool. All right. So like I said, we want to make sure we're keeping pace with the competition because your competitors out there are definitely going to be using automations. So the bottom line is Work Market and KRC research reported that 70% of business leaders reported that they spend 45 minutes to 3 hours on repetitive tasks during their 8-hour workday, which is an incredible amount of time spent on things that are repetitive. And as we'll see just in a moment here, things that are repetitive are likely things that you can automate. We can get all that time back if we can find the right automations. So automations allow you to be more productive and scale your business by allowing you to devote more of your time to higher level tasks. That is the end goal, right? We want to save time, we want to scale, we want to become more efficient. That's going to let you take your time and apply it to things that actually need your attention. Now we have to ask ourselves, okay, great, which tasks are deserving of your time? And so we're going to move into kind of this framework that we have where we're actually going to figure out how we can figure out which items in our business we can automate and which items we shouldn't automate. Before we do that, let's take a look at what happens to a lot of business owners when they first start thinking about automations. We have this sort of two-path problem. Most business owners will fall into one of these first two traps, which is, okay, great, I need to automate absolutely everything. And when you do that, you might run the risk of losing the personal touch that differentiates your business from the competition, right? So we can't actually automate everything, and we probably shouldn't want to automate everything. I have definitely talked to folks who are like, man, I would automate everything if I could. And honestly, I probably would too. The reality is, especially as creative small business owners, there's likely going to be places in your process that you need to have that personal touch in there where you want to go ahead and create a connection with a client that is not going to be automated. And that's actually a good thing, right? That's going to help our business in other ways to devote our time to spending those human hours on something, right? We can't actually take everything and automate it. And of course, on the entire opposite end of the spectrum, we have folks who really want to make sure that they retain that personal touch and therefore they automate 0% of things, right? They don't automate anything. Everything is manual. And of course, you're going to be able to have that personal touch on every single piece of your flow, but you run the risk of being overwhelmed. You run the risk of being overloaded in your workflow and not being able to scale. And obviously, we don't want either of these things. We don't want your business to lose its personal touch. We don't want your business to stagnate, to not be able to grow. So the reality is we need to find a middle line. We need to find somewhere in between these two places to live. And to do that, we can think about using this hands versus heart framework. And this is relatively intuitive. I think that most people out there would probably understand this without having it written out. But I think looking at something like this and writing it out can be helpful for referring back to if you have a difficult, task that you're trying to figure out if you want to automate it or not. But some general rules of thumb for you. So hands work would be things that are ripe for automation. So things that are repetitive and rule-based, right? If a client sends me this, I always send them this back. If there's a rule like that you can make in your head, it's probably something you can automate. Things like data transfers, right? Doing kind of manual copying and pasting is something that does take an incredible amount of time depending on what platforms you're using. And there's likely some kind of automation, maybe a Zap, but we're going to look at Zap here in just a minute as well. Something like a Dubsado lead capture form. Doesn't even sound like an automation. If you use the lead capture form, maybe you didn't realize it, but there is automations built into that lead capture form that we're going to look at, where it's taking the client's information and it's applying it into that project. That is automated, right? It's not actually requiring you to copy it over, but anything like data transfers, there's probably something out there that can be automated. Routine follow-ups, these are the really obvious ones that most people think of, right? When somebody goes ahead and fills out a form, we want to follow up with them, signs a contract, makes a payment, right? Any of these sort of client progress-based actions can likely be automated if we want to do some kind of follow-up. Administrative tasks, right? So this could be a pretty broad bucket from onboarding to just making sure everything's organized on the back end. So much of that can be automated nowadays, as well as status updates, right? So making sure that you're keeping track of your projects from one phase to the next, and Dubsado does this wonderfully. Now, on the other hand, we have heart work, right? Which are things that you should probably be devoting your human touch to, right? So relationship building. If you were an attendee at my Building Connections workshop, webinar a couple months ago, you probably saw that that is a lot of your human touch, your human mind going into making a connection with your clients, which is incredibly important for small business owners. Of course, some kind of follow-ups, like we mentioned in the other category, can be automated, but we want to make sure we're taking the time and giving ourselves the space to apply our own spirit, our own ethos into that connection to make sure that we are connecting with our clients. Things like creative strategy and conflict resolution, right? Your creative strategy can be assisted by things like generative AI, but you at the end of the day will need to make the executive decision about what kind of strategy you want to make. And God forbid you have conflict resolution, right? But it can happen with clients or employees, but difficult to automate those sorts of things as well. Celebratory moments, right? If you have big milestones met or you launched a project, those are great times to actually have that personal touch in there. And of course, there are smaller moments, like maybe a client's birthday that you want to automate, and that's totally fine. So of course, there's gray areas across the board here, but again, it's just a general framework. And then lastly, complex decision making, the most obvious one that we know that is very difficult to automate. This is the stuff that you really want to think to yourself, okay, if I can tackle all the items over here in this left-hand column, I have the most time for my complex decision making, which is really where you want to be spending your time as a small business. Let me pause here for a moment. Cool. All right. So if you're still curious about whether or not you should automate something, you can ask these questions to yourself, which is this task the same every time with predictable inputs and outputs? That's like we said, those repetitive tasks that have the same inputs and the same output, easily automated. And then am I doing the exact same thing repeatedly? Again, hands work. Whereas heart work would be, does this task require empathy, creativity, or complex judgments? Or does this interaction differentiate my business from my competitors? Both of those questions imply that you need to take that time as a human and actually go ahead and do it yourself. So like I said, now we'll jump into some non-Dubsado automations. And the first one I have in here is email signature links. And I'm starting very basic. I'm guessing most of you out there already do this. Let me know in the chat if you do this already. I'm curious. But having some links in your email signature can be a super easy way, and you might not even think about it as a an automation per se. But again, I'm considering things that are automations as anything that's really saving you time where you didn't actually have to go and do something else, right? And of course, there are more, obvious automations that we'll get to, but if you're someone who's like, I don't need to have links to my email signature, I'll just email them back. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with being someone who wants to send emails to their clients and say, hey, yeah, no problem. Here's a link to my booking guide, or here's a link to my PDF that has all my past work on it and stuff like that. That's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But having something like this that you can make very simply, I literally created this email signature in 2 seconds using AI actually, and you can code it and have these links put in there, even with these little favicons. It's extremely approachable to do these days. Back in the day, I know that you used to have to kind of go to one of those websites that you would punch it in and it would do it for you, would write the HTML. But there's so many different ways you can get it done nowadays. If you want to go ahead and create one of these, it's super straightforward to do. But obviously, the why you'd want to set this up, I was just talking about it. But you can have any kind of links you want in there. So I think people commonly have links to their socials, links to their websites, their booking guide, and even a call link can be really handy. But the idea is just to give clients access to links that they might frequently ask for anyways, simply saving you the email or saving the client really from having to go dig around looking for those links. And the book a call one's really nifty because especially if you're doing a lot of emailing with leads, right? Folks that aren't necessarily Dubsado users just Dubsado clients just yet. That way, if you're going back and forth with somebody, maybe you brought them in over from your social media and they go, you know what, I do want to work with this person. They don't have to reach out to you again and book. They can just book that call using the link in your signature. You can use Dubsado scheduler with the lead capture form to bring them into Dubsado. So we can kind of see how these automations kind of all start stacking together and rolling into one another nicely, which is great. But like I said, the email signature one is the low-hanging fruits. If you're not doing it, I highly recommend doing it. Here I have an example from my Gmail. I can set up this signature in Gmail just the same way as I can set it up in Dubsado. And just about every email platform, you should be able to do this. Catherine says, I have a link to my client portal on Dubsado. Yeah, fantastic. That's a perfect way to do it. That's a really perfect way to do it. Lisa, I can actually show you how to do this in Dubsado when we get to it. I don't want to jump to my Gmail if you don't mind, but I'm happy to show you where I set this up in Dubsado if you like. And it'll be relatively similar in Gmail or anywhere else you want to do it. All right. So the next one that I have on here is slightly more complicated, but not too bad. This is something that I was not really even super aware of until somewhat recently, but the idea that we can automate things on socials, right? I'm sure many of you out there have a presence on social media, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, whatever you have you. The example I have here is Instagram, simply because that's the one that I've used most frequently, and I was taking a look at how to set this up. But I'm sure you can do this on the other social medias as well. But the idea, you can have saved replies on Instagram, right? So we can go into our business account, and this does require a business account, but we can essentially create what we would call a macro, essentially, right? Where we've pre-typed out as some verbiage, right? Which is, in this case, my example is somebody inquires about a call. I can type in /call, and I can put in this whole phrase right here automatically, so I don't have to type it out every time, nor do I have to have my booking link saved like in the Notes app on my phone, and then copy and paste it in there. I can essentially go in and create a bunch of pre-typed out messages, and I can use a shortcut to put it into the chat right away. And I can get back to people on social media much, much quicker, which is really, really nice. Because if you have a nice social media presence and you put a lot of work into creating your social media presence to get more clients, then you don't want to be bogged down in replying to those people all day long, right? It's fantastic they're reaching out, but we do need to automate that a little bit. So like I said, a business account is required, and just this straightforward one can be set up really, really quickly. All you need to do is to go into your settings and find your saved replies and create those replies, and then start using them using that / in your DMs. You can even take this a step further, right? If you're someone who has Meta Business Suite, you can actually nowadays create your own AI to respond to people's questions intelligently via, for Instagram and for Facebook, for example. You can have it set up with some basic rules. If someone mentions a call, it sends them this thing. If someone mentions a proposal or a quote, that sends them this thing. And so that way you can have it actually be even smarter than just you going in there and doing it yourself. And it can be completely hands-free, which is really nifty. I wanted to include the instructions for how to do that, but they were just slightly longer than I'd want to fit on an entire slide. And I didn't want to bog you all down with really long instructions on that. But I'm happy to share these instructions if you like. And like I said, look into that Meta Business Suite if you're curious about setting up an AI for social media. Rima mentions that she was stuck answering messages back and forth in her social media DMs until she found Dubsado. Now I have automated messages that direct people to my website inquiry, which leads them to an automated workflow in Dubsado. Rima is absolutely killing the game. That is precisely what I'm talking about, Rima. So I love that. You already beat me to the punch there, Rima. And that's what I think most people should be doing nowadays, right? There's no reason, there's nothing stopping you from taking 2 minutes of your time, setting up a saved reply, putting your link to, in this case, I have a scheduler right here. I have a lead capture form attached to my scheduler. Someone can fill it out. It starts the workflow in Dubsado. That automation kicks off right from when your client first encounters you, and it's still going to be nice and customized for your clients. And it's going to be fantastic for saving you time. Really good example there, Rima. Cool. All right. Now, the last example I have here for a non-Dubsado automation is a little bit different, but I think it's really fun actually. So let's take a look. So here we have the idea that you could send an actual physical thank you card via Zapier. Now, if you are someone who's not familiar with Zapier, the really quick spark notes on Zapier is that it's essentially a connector, right? It's going to take thousands of different applications that don't have anything to do with each other. And you can have, if something happens in application A, another thing will happen in application B. And that is exactly what Zapier does. It's going to link those things together. Now you can use Zapier, like I said, for a ton of different things. I mean, there is literally sky's the limit on the number of things you can automate via Zapier. But something that I thought was a really nifty blend of that hand and heart work that I mentioned, right, is we could have a service, something like Handwritten, which is a really unique service that actually takes a robot and has a robot holding a pen on paper and it writes out a card that you've prescribed as to what you want the card to say. So it's a physical card and it's actually written in pen ink, but the robot's doing it, right? Maybe we want to have a Zap that's looking for a new payment to be received in Dubsado, and then we send a thank you card using Handwritten. And of course, there would be a subscription needed for Handwritten, but you can set the Zap up. I just did so in my free account, so no cost to you on the Zapier side of things. It's very straightforward. But why would you want to set this up? Well, maybe you do want to have that nice physical touch. You want to go the extra mile for your clients when they make a payment to you or do something similar to that, right? And people really aren't expecting cards in the mail anymore, right? If you're collecting their address and you want to send a thank you, why not? This took me a couple minutes to set up. All I did was type into Zapier's, little AI thing and say, hey, I want to connect Dubsado to Handwritten and do this, and it made it for me. So while you're automating things in your business, you'll find there are so many tools out there that will automate your automations, which is hilarious to me that we're at that phase now, but it's never been easier to set this kind of thing up. And again, this, like I said, this app is really straightforward the way that I set it up. I want to call out specifically our certified specialist, Todd Harper, who did some fantastic webinars last year, specifically on Zapier, some very long, in-depth Zapier webinars where he went through a bunch of different Zaps and answered a bunch of questions. So if you're someone who wants to roll up your sleeves with something like Zapier and really take your automations to the next level, I would highly recommend checking those out. You can find those on our YouTube channel. Just type in Zapier and it will come up. But again, his example has a little bit more complicated where he was looking for payments over a certain dollar amount. So there's an extra wrinkle in there. Totally doable. And he set that up in just a couple minutes as well. So just want to throw out one option to you all there. I know that Zapier is sort of its own rabbit hole to get into as far as automation is concerned, but this does not take too long to set up. And I really want to encourage folks to try things, get experimental. If you're like, can I do this? If you're thinking about maybe, can I do this? There's probably some way to get it done. And it's a lot easier than you think, especially with a lot of the tools that we have nowadays. Angela says, "Ooh, for long term, for new clients or long term clients." Yeah, exactly right. I think that you could have maybe one flow set up for new clients is like, "Hey, thanks so much for kind of joining the gang," and then you have long term clients is like, "Hey, thanks so much for sticking around." Right? You could do two different flows or have the same flow. There's so much you could do with this. Rima says she's stuck in the middle of the workflow, so I'm hoping to gain more tips today. Gotcha. Rima, you're in the right place. We're going to jump into Dubsado in just a moment here. Cool. All right, let's take a pause there for a moment. How are we feeling, folks? I know that I'm doing a lot of talking, and we're going to get to our demos here in just a minute, but how are we feeling? Everybody feeling good? Fantastic. Awesome. Good. Okay, great. We got 100 people in here. Love it. Awesome. Cool. And hi, Lisa. It's not lost on me. Lisa and I were just chatting in chat the other day, so I wanted to say hey. Britt says, this is day one for me, and I'm so glad to hop on this webinar. Britt, thank you for being here today. I really do appreciate it. Welcome to Dubsado. Welcome to our webinars. I could not be more happy to have you here. So thank you. Awesome. All right, folks. So now that we've talked about some non-Dubsado automations, let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we can do in Dubsado. And like I mentioned at the outset, there's obviously a ton you can do in Dubsado, so we're not going to have time to really tackle every single little thing, but I do have what I would consider some heavy hitters as far as things that you can and should be doing in your accounts. And none of these things take long to set up. And that's really what I want to hammer home. That was kind of the idea of setting up this bite-sized automations is that folks think, Okay, I know I need to automate. I've seen the data. I've seen why I need to automate. I know what it can do for me. I have an idea of what actions I should automate. Fantastic. Now I just need to go do. You get into that like kind of decision paralysis and the like, I just need to start, but it's going to take so long and it's difficult. No. So many of these automations are built into Dubsado in such a way that it takes less than a minute to set up. And as soon as you start ticking things off your list, you'll see, holy crap, man, I've automated so much stuff that I wasn't doing automatically already. It is going to save you so much time. So that's really the stuff that I want to talk about today. Would be things like your scheduler confirmation reminder emails with specifically with the right smart fields to let clients schedule, reschedule, cancel, or add to their calendar, because that's the piece that might take time is the rescheduling and the canceling and the adding. We're going to take a look at payment plan reminders, right? These ones are obvious. I know many of you probably out there are using them, but if you're someone like Britt who's brand new, super important to know how to set up those automatic payment reminders so you're not tracking down payments. And we'll take a closer look at a Dubsado lead capture form. So obviously, like I mentioned earlier, right, it's doing some of that base work for you where it's taking in the client information, creating a project, it's saving your information to the project. But there's a couple of tiny little automations in the settings that I think get overlooked frequently, and we should talk about those as well. And then lastly, we're going to look at three specific triggers. We're going to look at after form not completed, after invoice installment paid, and after contract signed. Three really powerful workflow triggers that you don't need to have a full-on long workflow built out in order to use them. But it is important to understand how to make use of them because you could have them in a one-off workflow or as part of a longer workflow if you like. So that's kind of our ground rules for what we're going to look at in Dubsado, and let's get right into it. So there we go. So here I am in my Dubsado accounts. I'm in my schedulers area. And folks, while I'm doing this, I know you guys have been very active in the chat so far, and I really appreciate it. If you have questions about anything that I'm doing, go ahead and throw it right there in the chat. We'll tackle it. All right. So here I am. I have my discovery call scheduler, and this is just set up in a relatively default way. Let's just pretend that this was customized to my liking and I liked all this. What I want to look at specifically is the confirmation and the reminder emails. So as a quick reminder for anybody who hasn't taken a look at a scheduler, maybe you haven't used it yet, or just if you haven't looked at the settings in a little bit, a discovery call right here, we can go into the advanced settings to take a look at our confirmation and our reminder emails. If you scroll down just a little bit, we have right here the confirmation email dropdown. And like I said, this is going to work as a little bit of a reminder if you've been in Dubsado, but the reason this is blank is on purpose, actually. I can leave this blank if I want to, and the system will automatically use the default confirmation email, which in my opinion is pretty decent. It has a lot of links in there already, but of course I can choose any canned email that I want to use as my confirmation email. Whenever somebody books an appointment, they're going to go ahead and receive said confirmation email. Now, we actually want to take a look at what's in that email. So if I want to figure out, okay, maybe I want to make an edit to that default confirmation email, where would you go to do that? So from here right now, I'm in schedulers. I'm going to go into my canned emails. Here's a list of all my canned emails. But if I'm looking specifically at the default templates, I can go up to the top and say edit templates. And here's a list of all the default canned emails in the system. So in this case, I'm going to look at appointments confirmed. And this would be that default email. So if you leave that confirmation email slot blank on your scheduler, this is the email that's going to go out. Now, specifically, we want to look at the smart fields that are in this email because that's where it's going to save us the most time. Starting from the top here, we have hi client first name, so it's going to be populated in the client's name. We have our brand name, the appointment with the brand name has been confirmed. We've got the date and the time, pretty standard stuff here, right? Then I also have the location field, which is nifty if you have an in-person appointment. Obviously, we can change this to the virtual link if you have a video conferencing service connected right there. We also have the appointment duration, and we have a calendar link. This is one of the first ones I wanted to talk about here. So let's say that your email looks like this, because I think I've edited this email a little bit since this was put into my account. Let's say I wanted to add an add to calendar link, which would allow my clients to go ahead and click a button in the email, and it would automatically get added to their calendar, which is really nifty to make sure that clients don't forget the appointments. So to do that, I'd go to Smart Fields. I'm going to scroll over here to Appointments. And then from there, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down and click Add to Calendar Link. So that's the smart field that was already in there. I just wanted to show you how to find it. But the idea is this smart field right here, once it's actually sent in an email, will turn into a link that clients can click, and it will automatically add it to their calendar or invite them to add it to their calendar. I think these are a no-brainer. I see a lot of folks who have schedulers set up without this, and it's probably on accident. But the idea is we want to make sure clients have this on their calendar so they're not missing it. There's no reason not to have this in your confirmation email. The next smart field we want to add in here is going to be added the exact same way. I'm going to go to Smart Fields, I'm going to go to Appointments, And this time I'm actually going to go ahead and put in reschedule button. Now, of course, your mileage may vary, right? Some folks don't want to give clients the option to reschedule because they might feel like it encourages them to reschedule. But if you're someone who, has relatively decent availability and you're just trying to make your client's life a little bit easier, this can be really handy because it prevents them from needing to send you an email and say, ah, crap, I got to reschedule. Okay, what's the next time you have? Then you get back into that manual back and forth mode, which we want to avoid. Putting this appointment reschedule button in there will allow clients to click reschedule. It will reopen your scheduler and allow them to pick a new date and time. And it keeps everything nice and streamlined. So I don't think there's any reason not to put this in your email as well, unless maybe you have an issue with a lot of clients needing to reschedule. And the exact same concept is there as well. If I go ahead and add one more line here, I'll say smart field, appointments, and I'll say cancel, right? So same exact thing. Let's clients go ahead and cancel without sending you an email. Every time somebody sends you an email about anything, whether they're asking for a link, asking to reschedule, asking to cancel, it's another couple seconds that your brain has to devote to something else that you have to go ahead and pull yourself away from that high level work. And we should just be putting these links in our emails, right? Giving our clients the ability to do it sort of themselves. Let me take a look at chat here. I know the chat's kind of popping off. All right. Angelina asks, does the Dubsado schedule automatically create a calendar event in the client's calendar? Uh, that way the other schedulers do if they don't click. Yeah, good question, Angelina. So what the client would need to do is either click this add to calendar link to add that event to their calendar, or when they first finish their booking, it'll actually surface the exact same link on the confirmation page and they can click it there as well. So currently it won't do it automatically. The client needs to click add to calendar, but with Dubsado 3.0, which if you've been paying attention to our socials is on the horizon, this is going to be vastly improved so that we won't even have to have clients clicking anything. So in the future, it will be better, but for right now, this add to calendar link is your friend. Matt says, if I set up a virtual video call, will the client automatically get that link? Great question, Matt. You took the words out of my mouth. That was kind of the last thing I wanted to show here, which was, hey, I have this location field here, right? This is specifically looking at a physical location, but what if I have a virtual call? In this case, that physical location doesn't matter, right? We're not meeting physically. I'd actually want to use a different smart field. So I can go ahead and say smart field appointments. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit again, and I'm going to say appointment conferencing link. So if you have, Zoom or Microsoft Teams or another service connected to your Dubsado account for video conferencing, and you have that conferencing enabled on your scheduler, make sure you have this particular smart field in your confirmation or your reminder email to make sure that that link does get populated. This smart field right here is responsible for making sure that that link shows up in the email. Good question there. Okay, cool. All right, apologies about the hiccups, folks. I think I probably have literally too many tabs open on my computer. It's giving out on me. All right, we're going to move on to the next automation here, folks. So I know we have some questions in the Q&A. I'm going to jump back to those at the very end if you guys don't mind. I'm just trying to keep track of chat for right now. So next up, we're going to take a look at automatic payment plan reminders. So I'm going to go into templates. I'm going to go into payment plans. So right now I have a couple of different payment plans in my account. And as we can see, right, this one's pretty straightforward. It's 3 installments. I'm just dividing the grand total of the invoice up by 3. And as we can see, I don't have any reminders on here. So I can add reminders very, very straightforwardly. They're basically done on a per installment basis. I'm gonna go ahead and click into this first installments to expand it. And then at the bottom of this area right here, I can click add reminder. I'm going to go ahead and set this up to be maybe, let's see, something like 3 days before due dates at 9 a.m., right? I can control when this email goes out. I can say if it's before or after. I can set this to be in any number of days, weeks, or months before or after that installment is due. And keep in mind, this is per installment. So it's not for the grand total of the invoice. It depends on how many installments you have. And you can set as many of these reminders up as you like. The really nifty thing about our automatic payment reminders is I call them smart reminders because they are not going to send out if the client makes the payments on time, right? Of course, if you set this to go out, a week before the due dates, it will go out because they probably haven't thought to pay it yet. But yeah, I digress. These reminders will not send if that payment is marked as paid, essentially. So if you have something like 3 days after due date, right? You're giving the client 3 days to go ahead and make that payment after the due date is there. We can go ahead and assume, hey, it's not going to send to them if they go ahead and make that payment. So it's really nice. We're not going to go ahead and spam our clients with emails if they're making payments around the time that it's due. And like I said, you can have as many of these on there as you want to. So let's leave this on 3 days before at 9 a.m. And again, I can pick any canned email here that I like, but right now I'm just going to use the default payment reminder. I'll say apply. Maybe I want to add another reminder. I can go ahead and say add reminder once again. And maybe this time I want to have 0 days before due date. So on the due date, I can say another reminder there. And then maybe I want to do one for after. Let's do something like 5 days after. I can say apply. Cool. So now I have just on this one installment, I've got three different reminders, one going out 3 days before the due date, on the due date, and then 5 days after using my default payment reminder. And again, this is going to look specifically at the due date of this particular installment. So in this case, 0 days after payment plan applied to invoice, that would be immediately, right? But of course, the same concept would apply to any of your different installments. And it's going to time it out based off of this due date. And it's going to intelligently think, hey, did they make a payment on this installment or not? If they have not, and that reminder trigger comes to pass, it will send that reminder. And then as soon as they pay, it will not send any remaining reminders. So hopefully that checks out for folks. Todd asks, if I change a payment plan, does it change the plan for all past instances? Great question, Todd, and no. So essentially, when you take a payment plan and you apply it to an invoice in a project, think about it like it's taking a snapshot, right? It's just taking a snapshot of the way that that payment plan was when you applied it. If you later go down the line and you make changes to your payment plan templates because you need to update something, the past iteration that you already used with that project is going to stay the same way that it was. It's never going to make a change to an invoice that's already in flight, essentially. Cool, no worries, Todd. Britt says, this is so nice. My current system notifies clients of their plan expiring, even if they attend/booked all of their appointments, which is frustrating. That would definitely be frustrating. Yeah. I think that something like using payment plan reminders, like I said, if you are not doing this in your Dubsado accounts and you're taking payments online, there's no reason not to use this because it works. It's one of those kind of no-brainer things. It just works. You set up some reminders, it's going to time it out based off the due dates, and it won't send if they paid. That's all people are really asking for, right? Is I don't want to spam my clients, and it's super easy to set up. I can add these in a couple clicks, which is really, really nice. Of course, I could go ahead and do the same thing to my other installments, but hopefully that illustrates the point there, folks. We can add these reminders onto any installments. Right now, I'm just doing this on a payment plan template, but of course, if you had an active invoice, let's go to a project real quick. Let's take a look at Marcus Cooper. Let's go to the Invoices tab. Let's say that maybe I want to add an additional reminder onto this particular installment. I can say edit. I can go ahead and click in this installment, and let's go ahead and add another reminder on here. Be like 5 days after. So it doesn't have to just be in that payment plan area. You can do this on an active invoice. You can make a change. I can say after invoice, say apply, and now we've added an additional reminder onto that particular installment, right? So if you need to make changes, need to add reminders, someone's still not getting back to you, making a payment, we can keep adding reminders if you want to. And then we can see here in the project view, we can see that this was sent and when it was sent, which is nice. If a reminder is ever not sent because they did pay, it'll be red and say, the date that it wasn't sent, essentially. Tara says, is there a way to have the reminders set up by groups? I always have clients who have installments for 6 to 10 months, and for each installment, I have to create 4 reminders. You mean like to add all 4 reminders at the same time, Tara? If that was what you're asking, then unfortunately, there's not a way to do that. The best case there would be just to template it out in your payment plan. And once you've done it once in the payment plan templates, then you shouldn't have to be creating those reminders over and over again. It should be relatively quick. Yeah, I apologize about that. If you have your canned email that you're using for your reminder already set up, then you are creating that payment plan template once. It'll be a couple clicks to add those for each installment. But once you do it once, you should be good to go. All right, we're going to take a look at this brand story lead capture form. And it's just a basic lead capture form that I set up with a little bit of branding on here, right? We got some nice questions. I've got some how can we help? Fantastic, right? I think some folks who are at least a little bit acquainted with Dubsado will know that we want to ask for clients' information like their first name, their last name, and their email. And we want to make sure that we're actually mapping the information to the correct category. I actually have this mapped incorrectly. Biggest challenge is not client phone number, but the idea is if we're asking for a first name, we want to map this to the client's first name so that the way the system knows what kind of information we're collecting. Obviously, that's a tiny little automation, but if you're not doing this, you're not mapping fields, you'll get new projects created in Dubsado, but you're not going to be able to access that information very easily. You should have to dig back into the actual form submission. So aside from actually setting up your lead capture form with questions that you need to ask and making sure that your clients are kind of getting in the door efficiently, I want to take a look at the form settings over here on the left-hand side. So obviously we have what's called a default workflow, and we're going to talk about workflows in just a moment here, but the idea is we can have a lead capture form create new projects, but we can also have a lead capture form kick off any workflow that we like. That's one of the lead capture form's primary functions. So if you didn't know how to actually connect your workflows in Dubsado to your lead capture form, this right here is how you would do it. You would go ahead and go to the default workflow and click any of your workflows to go ahead and connect it to your lead capture form. Then anytime somebody fills out the form, it will start that workflow. That one's hopefully pretty obvious. And the ones that are further down are the ones that I wanted to dig into a little bit more of, right? We have things like a redirect URL, right? Which can actually be any URL that you like. And you can go ahead and redirect clients who submit your form to any web page that you like, right? So in this case, I have my websites. I've got my 3Devs design here, and I have a thank you page that's hidden, right? So maybe I want to redirect them back to my thanks page. It actually says, hey, thanks so much, instead of using the default thank you message, which can be a really handy dandy way to kind of direct them back to look at your resources or any of your portfolio information or anything like that. But the one down here, project status and project title. So in Dubsado, right, hopefully you have some project statuses set up already that accurately describe your business flow. And if you haven't come back into your lead capture form after you set that up, I highly recommend you do it because we can control what status these new projects go into, right? If I click in this drop down, this is just showing me all the different statuses that I have in my accounts. I have built out a new lead status, a call book status, proposal sent, leads proposal, contract sent, so on and so forth, right? And your statuses are probably going to be different than mine. This is just for my fake web design business. But we can go ahead and determine, hey, I want to make sure that my projects that are created by this lead capture form are categorized correctly. I want to make sure they go into new lead. By setting this right here, I can make sure that they don't just go into my all leads bucket where they might be a little bit harder to find, especially if you're somebody who has a lot of leads coming in. We can dictate what status we want to give those new projects. This gets even more helpful if you're someone who has more than one lead capture form. Maybe you have a website lead capture form that's separate from a social media lead capture form, and you want to be able to do different things with those clients when they come in. You might have a new website lead versus a new social media lead, and you would have two different statuses, and you could have each of those lead capture forms directing new projects to each of those buckets. So like I said, being able to route projects correctly is really powerful, and I think it gets overlooked because, of course, you could go into your projects and you could go to your leads and then recategorize it from there. Those are extra clicks that you just don't need to be doing. And Dubsado has this built in for you right here. The last thing I wanted to talk about is the project title. We can actually create naming conventions using some smart fields, right? So if I go ahead and wipe this out of here, right now I have it set to client name dash website build. I can use any client smart fields to populate the project's title. So making sure that I have asked that information, then I'll have that information available. So in this case, I'm asking for first name and last name, which means I could go ahead and populate the client full name to go ahead and be part of the project title. And then if this is always going to be a website build, maybe this is the website build lead capture form, and maybe you have different services for a different lead capture form, I could go ahead and just say dash website build. Oops. Sorry, it's been an hour since I typed anything. My fingers gotta wake up a little bit. But yeah, the idea is any kind of client information that I'm collecting here, whether it's their email, their phone, any of that other client info that I've already mapped here on the lead capture form, as long as I've mapped it, the client will be giving it to you, and you can go ahead and use that info in the project title. I know that people can be really particular about their project titles, understandably so, because I'm exactly like that. When I'm setting up stuff in Dubsado, it has to kind of all match. And it can be a really great way to just automate that convention. You don't need to spend time customizing those titles and punching it all in manually when you get a new lead. Have your lead capture form set up to name them appropriately when you first get it in the door. All right, and now I've ignored chat for just a moment here, but let me get back into chat. Okay. Jennifer asks, how do I get my lead capture form to look pretty like yours? We've got some really great webinars as well going over form building. So I do recommend going on our YouTube channel if you want to check out some form building tutorials where I build a very similar lead capture form just like this one. You can check that out on our YouTube channel. It's from one of our recent webinars for form building. Myself and Angela Munoz actually did, we each did a webinar on form building. So if you're curious about how to do that, Jennifer, check those out. All right. And Britt asks, does the status change automatically or does that have manual touch points? That's a great question, Britt. I think that's a perfect point to pivot us into workflows. So if I back out of our lead capture form here, Britt was asking about these statuses, right? So if I have statuses or if I have projects going into my new lead statuses automatically via my lead capture form, at that point, then you could choose to do one of two things. You could manually move a project from one to the other. So in this case, Rachel Green is currently a call booked. I could manually move her to leads proposal if I want to, and I would move her into my next status. But we can definitely automate that with a workflow. So let's take a look at some workflows here. I'm gonna go to templates, I'm gonna go to workflows. Right now I just have a couple of some simple basic workflows in my account. I'm gonna create a new workflow and kind of just talk you guys through how to understand these triggers. Because specifically we're gonna be talking about the after form not completed, after invoice installment paid, and after contract signed. Those three triggers I think are kind of overlooked or can be a little bit confusing at times for folks if you're just getting into workflows. So we're gonna dive into those. If I go ahead and say add a new workflow, let's just call this webinar test and say next step. So right now I've got a blank workflow. If we're going to be talking about our after form not completed to begin with, let's go ahead and send a. The idea with after form not completed is we want to do something after a client does not complete a form. So to begin with, let's say that my lead capture form is submitted and the first thing I want to do is send my clients a questionnaire. So let's say add an action. I'm going to go ahead and say send a form. Now I'm going to go ahead and choose maybe a questionnaire to complete. Let's say it's this supplemental intake form. And otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and ignore the email copy since we don't care too much about the wording for the time being. I'm going to go ahead and say apply. So this workflow now has one action where I'm going ahead and sending one form. And then maybe I want to wait a couple of days for my client to fill out the form before I do something else. Maybe I want to follow up with them, right? In this case, we can go ahead and add an additional action. So let's say add action. This time, maybe I want to just send them a pleasant email that just says, hey, just following up and making sure that you saw my email before. So nothing crazy. We'll say send email. Now, in this case, we're looking at this when setting here. This is where we're going to find all of your different triggers. As I mentioned, we're talking specifically about after form is not completed right now. So this is a kind of conditional trigger that's only going to fire if the client does not fill out the form after a certain number of days. So I'm going to pick after form is not completed. And now I can decide how many days I want to wait for them to actually fill out their form. So if I go ahead and do something like maybe 5 days after form is not completed, then I can go ahead and say, hi, just checking in. And I can go ahead and tell it to watch for the questionnaire that I sent earlier. With a lot of these kind of conditional ones, there is an extra step of adding the what to watch in the actual workflow action here. In this case, it's only going to display to me the forms I've sent in this workflow so far. So since I've only sent this website's intake form, it knows, hey, there's only one form in this workflow, so I know I want to watch the website intake form. So now the system is just being told, hey, keep an eye on that form I sent, and if 5 days go by, I want to send this email if they haven't filled out that form. So it's as simple as picking the correct trigger, setting up the number of days you want to give the clients to fill out the form, and then we can go ahead and tell it to watch the form you want it to kind of time things off of. And of course, if you have other forms in your workflow, it'll show you all the forms in the workflow. Just pick the one that you want to time it off of. And then I can go ahead and type my email body. And again, I'm kind of ignoring the actual copy in here since we're just kind of looking at the functionality, but I can go ahead and say apply. So now I have a 2-action workflow, and it took me 2 seconds to set up if we go ahead and ignore the fact that those emails are a little bit sparse. But the idea here is I'm sending a website intake form, a questionnaire, and then 5 days later, if they have not completed the form, we're going to go ahead and send an email that checks in with them. And this action here will not send if they fill out the form before 5 days elapses. So it operates very similarly to the way our payment reminders work, where it's not going to send something. It will just end up grayed out. So it's really nice, right? We can go ahead and set ourselves up a little bit of a safety net to send the clients a reminder while knowing that they're not going to be bombarded with an extra email if they do fill it out on time. All right. And again, folks, I do apologize. There's too many questions for me to get to in just this hour here. I know we're already running out of time, but let me kind of scroll to the bottom of the most recent ones and see if there's something relevant to what we're talking about right now. All right. All right, let's see here. Britt says, I feel like I'm nerding out too much. This is actually really cool. I'm really glad you're enjoying it, Britt. That's fantastic. All right. Catherine had a good question. If you sent the form outside of the workflow, does the form to watch trigger still work? Great question, Catherine, and the answer is no. The workflow is going to be looking at the instance of the form being sent in the workflow, right? So if I sent a form just in a project by itself, the workflow itself doesn't know that you sent that form. So if you're in a situation where you're like, okay, I need to add a form to a workflow, or I need to add a new form that's not in my workflow, you can always edit the workflow in the project, add that form, and then you'll have the ability to watch it later down the road. That's an important distinction to call out there, Catherine. That was a good question. Is it's not going to know that you sent that form elsewhere. It needs to be in your workflow. Good question. Let's move on to our next trigger. All right. So we talked about after form not completed, which can be a really handy one if you're trying to, like I said, time things around forms being not completed. The next one we have is after invoice installment paid. So now we're going to go ahead and maybe let's just wipe out these 2 actions and just start fresh. So now I'm back to a blank workflow template. If I'm looking for after an invoice installment is paid, I want to time something specifically after one payment on the invoice has been made, not just paying the entire thing. I'm looking at just one particular invoice installment. And there's a very specific way to set this up. So you see here at the top where it says payment plan optional. You might be thinking to yourself, man, I've never used this area. I don't know what that does. And this is exactly what it's for, actually. So if I go ahead and select a payment plan, let's go ahead and choose a 3 installments payment plan. Now the workflow is adding this payment plan so it can actually watch those installments. Kind of like I was mentioning to Catherine, right? If we want the workflow to be able to watch something or be aware of something happening in the project's workflow, it needs to be in the workflow, generally speaking. So I'm going to go ahead and add this payment plan to the workflow, and now the workflow can keep an eye on when those due dates are occurring, and we can look for payments and that sort of thing, right? So if I go ahead and add that payment plan, we're good to go. Now let's actually add in something like I want to send maybe a proposal, right? Let's go ahead and pick my proposal. Not public proposal. Let's pick my regular proposal. Beautiful. So now we have this workflow sending a proposal. which maybe includes my contract and invoice. And I want to look for when they make that first payment on that invoice. And keeping in mind, right, the workflow is responsible for adding this payment plan. So I don't need to have a payment plan on my proposal itself. It's already added here by the workflow. And now let's go ahead and say add an action. And let's go ahead and say send an email. Again, really simple option, right? Just the simplest one being just to send an email. We can go ahead and say after a invoice installment is paid. Now, this option will actually not show up at all in this drop-down list if you do not pick a payment plan in the workflow. It straight up just doesn't appear in this drop-down. It only functions correctly if you have one picked in this drop-down right here. So keep that in mind if you're looking for it. You need to make sure you pick that payment plan first, and then you'll see the option here. But I can go and say after invoice installment paid. And now again, right, an additional option is popping up. It's going to ask me which installment I want to watch. So in this case, I can go ahead and say that first installment is 0 days after payment plan is applied to the invoice. And now I can time this email about whether or not the client actually makes that payment. And when they do, I can send this email. So I can say, something like, thanks so much. Thanks. So really nifty way to go ahead and have your finger on the pulse of the client's journey going, okay, cool. I sent them my proposal. Hopefully they sign the contract. I'm waiting for them to make that first payment. And as soon as they make that first payment, now they're officially a client. I want to congratulate them and say, thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. The client's going to go, oh, that was nifty, right? Like I got a receipt. I got a thank you email. I'm good to go. The client's going to feel like you really have their best interest at heart and that you're excited to work with them. I think after invoice installment paid is a really powerful one because you're running a business, right? There's nothing more important than A, getting paid, right? We can look at things, making sure people are getting paid, and B, your client going, yes, I'm making a good choice here. Like I said before, the key is making sure we add that payment plan to your webinar. Webinar. Add that payment plan to your workflow templates, and then making sure we're telling it to watch the correct installments. Catherine asks, are these drop-down options presets or do we have to create them? Great question. These are all presets, essentially. All of the triggers that you see here in this drop-down are created and generated by Dubsado. There isn't a way to make your own presets here, unfortunately, but as we can see, there are quite a few number of different triggers, so you have quite a number of options as far as creating automations is concerned. All right, folks. Last example here we have today is after a contract is signed. Hopefully there weren't any other questions about invoice installment paid. We'll go ahead and cancel this out. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove this and we'll remove that. So again, starting fresh from a blank workflow. After contract signed is probably the most commonly used one of these that I see because it's the easiest to set up, I think, actually. We saved the easiest one for last. Is essentially, this is the one instance where you actually don't need to have sent the contract in the workflow. And that's for a very specific reason. We're talking about, right, if the payment plan's not on there, that invoice one won't work, or if you don't send a form in the workflow, then that form reminder won't work. Contracts are sort of a unique vehicle in Dubsado because every project can only have one. So the webinar, I keep saying webinars or workflow. The workflow doesn't have to be told which contract to look for because there is only ever one. So the nice thing about this is it will work no matter what. I could have sent the contract separately in a different email. I could have sent it with my proposal in an email that's not in the workflow. It doesn't matter how I send my contract, as long as I do it through Dubsado, obviously. I can always use after contract signed. But for our case, let's keep it nice and simple. I'll go ahead and say add an action. Let's go ahead and say send contract, right? We're sending the contract in the workflow. I'll pick my contract. We'll go ahead and apply it. So let's say that I'm sending the contract, and then as soon as the contract is signed, I want to go ahead and do something. And again, we'll use the send email as an example. I'll say add an action. I'll say send an email, and I may just do another one that's like, thank you, right? Thanks so much for signing. Congrats, we're in. So send an email. The when setting after, instead of doing after all previous actions complete, we can do after contract signed by client. In this case, I'll do it 0 days after contract signed by client, so it's immediate, but you could always do a delay if you want to, something like, 1 hour after, 1 hour after the contract signed, however you wanted to do it. You could obviously play with the when setting. But again, after contract signed is probably the lowest hanging fruit as far as setting up these triggers is concerned, because you can use this no matter if you've sent it in a workflow or not. We can have a two-step workflow in here that's just sending clients emails after they sign their contract without doing too much else. I really wouldn't even have to have this first action in here. I could get away with just doing it like this. If I remove this first step, and if maybe part of my process is to send a contract manually, this workflow would still work. It would always send this email after they sign their contract because I've sent that contract elsewhere. All right, folks. Britt says that would be the function to use then, send a copy of the contract, right? I'm not quite sure I understand, Britt. If you send a contract anywhere in Dubsado in your project, right, it's not gonna create multiple copies. If you send a contract in a project outside of a workflow, and then later on send a contract in a workflow, it'll just send them the same link again. It's just that one link. Like I said, contracts are a little bit unique because there can only be one on a project. All right. Drew had a good question. I think this might be one of the last questions we get to before we sign off here, folks. Drew asks, when you said with the invoice and contract attached, the initial proposal sent, in your example, how do you attach the additional documents? I'd like my welcome email to include the invoice and contracts. Great question, Drew. So if I go to templates and then I go to forms, I can actually take a proposal and I can include the contract and invoice. I had half a mind to include this as one of the things I wanted to dive a little deeper on, but I knew I was going to be pressed for time and we were already 5 minutes over here, so I think I was right. But the idea with the proposal is you do have a lot of automation options here as well. If I go ahead and take a look at my 3Dubs design proposal, if your initial email that you're sending back to clients, Drew, is a proposal, you can go ahead and do this, right? We can have a send form action in your workflow that sends your proposal, but the proposal can also include your contract and your invoice. So if I go into the form settings, I can go ahead and choose the include contract option, and I can choose the include invoice option. If I turn these both to yes, it's going to go ahead and display the contract and then display the invoice afterwards, right? That way the client can fill out the proposal, fill out the contract, and fill out or pay the invoice all in one step. Keep in mind that this does not need to be turned on for the invoice to be generated. The proposal will always generate the invoice. This is just determining whether or not the invoice is shown, which is pretty cool. So, like I said, Drew, right here in the settings, you would go ahead and turn both those options on, and then it's going to be including both of those things there. All right, folks. Well, PDF for the records. Let's see here. Gotcha. So the PDF of the records, if whenever somebody signs a contract, whenever a client signs a contract, the system automatically emails them a PDF for their records. So it's handled for you automatically, Brett. They will automatically get a standalone email that just says, hey, you signed this contract and here's a PDF. If that's what you're asking about. Cool. All right, folks. Again, I do apologize. We've gone a little bit long. Let me take a quick glance to the Q&A questions since I did not have a chance to get to them. I'm guessing most of these are going to be good questions to ask our chat, but we'll take 2 seconds to look at it. Whew. I know I had whole slides and thank you slides and everything. We just went a little bit long here, folks. I appreciate it. Let's take a quick look through this real quick. Jeremy asks, is there any reason we'd want to leave the default canned email alone or create our own? For example, does Dubsado update the canned emails if we haven't customized, meaning we might not be aware of the cool new things that we can consider? That's a good question, Jeremy. For right now, there wouldn't be too much of a reason to use a custom canned email versus the default. But when we move into 3.0, that you might want to reevaluate your canned emails at that point to make sure that there's nothing you want to adjust. But yeah, Jeremy, hopefully that makes sense. For right now, there's not too much of a reason to go ahead and customize if you just like the default canned email. But we'll definitely make sure we let everybody know if there's new stuff you should kind of take a look at. All right. Okay, folks, I'm going to go ahead and have to cut it off there. But I really do want to thank everybody so much for being here today. I appreciate everyone's time. I really do appreciate it. Hopefully you were able to get something out of this today. And I know we went through a lot of content and we had so many good questions. So again, I want to thank you all so much. If you have any other questions or questions that I unfortunately didn't get to, I would really encourage you to send us an email to hello@dubsado.com. And otherwise, you can use that chat bubble in your account as well if you want to just do that from your Dubsado accounts. But I really appreciate it. Everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we will catch you on the next one.